Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on Catholic social teachings, today's Do You Know question is, do you know why Catholic social teaching insists on the preferential option for the poor? The term preferential option for the poor is a recent term in church documents. It was first issued in the two documents that came out of the Latin American Church, the 1968 document and the 1979 document from Medellin in Colombia and Pueblo in Mexico, in which they showed and spoke about a concern of the church for the poor. Especially in Latin America, where this was extremely important given what was going on in the society there. But the concern for the poor has been based from the very beginning on the life and ministry of Jesus himself. It's based on Scripture, in which we have, express command in Scripture with regards to concern for the poor in the Beatitudes, in Mary's Magnificat, in Matthew 25, whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me, and finally in Luke chapter 4, in which the Spirit of the Lord sends Jesus to proclaim good news to the poor, and so on. So it's been part of our tradition all along to be concerned for the poor. That's what the role of a disciple is, a preferential option for the poor. The Latin American Church was very much, the Latin American conferences that came out of Medellin and Pueblo were very much concerned with the way society was treating the poor. And their preferential option really caused a shift in understanding of the image of church, which for centuries had been focused on a concern for the wealthy landowners and really, aligning themselves with the upper classes. So the Latin American Church wanted to do a balance to this, saying that yes, the rich are part of God's people, but so are the poor, and the rich have a responsibility to care for the poor and redress this balance. Outside of Latin America, especially in many wealthy countries, they saw this as a negative move on the part of the Latin American Church because they began to see it as buying into a Marxist class struggle mentality. But this was not what the Latin American Church was doing. It was trying to redress, as we said before, a balance between the rich and their responsibility to care for the poor as well. Francis is the first Latin American Pope, and he is very true to his Latin American roots in being and promoting, advocating that our church is for and of the poor. And he himself, his whole life, especially before becoming Pope and currently as Pope, is a living, authentic witness to the church's concern for the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. So, Catholic social teaching from the very beginning, starting with Pope Leo XIII in 1891, with his own encyclical on the poor, and 100 years later, John Paul II, in Centesimus Annus, literally 100 years after Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum, addressed the need of labor to be concerned for and attuned to the needs of the poor and vulnerable, and making sure that labor becomes something that is available for the poor and vulnerable and the care and concern for them. Pope Francis, as a major focus of his papacy and his whole life has been that no one is disposable. Especially in poor countries. So what would preferential option for the poor look like in wealthy countries like the United States? Well, I'd like to make some suggestions that are based on the book Living Justice by Thomas Massaro, where he summarizes some of the way in which Catholic social teaching advocates wealthy countries to really make preferential option for the poor a reality. And so here are some suggestions. First of all, wealthy countries and wealthy citizens are to become aware of how our actions really impact the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. We need to examine and revise our lifestyle choices and our social, our personal decisions with regards to how we interact with the poor and the vulnerable. We need to advocate for policies and for social justice that really advocate for the poor and vulnerable. To advocate for more taxation so that that money can be funneled for the needs of the poor and vulnerable. To really advocate for an advanced safety net that really provides for the needs of the poor and vulnerable. And for better funding, especially for schools, educational services, especially in poor neighborhoods where they don't have the advantage of other wealthy social institutions and so on. So, to summarize, in other words, Catholic social teachings insists that there has to be a united effort by church, by government, by society in general, to advocate for a more humane society which treats all of its citizens, most especially the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized, in a humane way, with dignity, with respect, with some sort of justice, so that the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized have the ability to live a decent and dignified life for themselves, for their families, and so on. So, bottom line in Catholic social teaching would say that all social institutions would and should be judged on the basis of the way they treat all, most especially the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. I'd like to end with just one brief quote from, again, the document that we've been using, Sharing Catholic Social Teaching, Challenges and Directions from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And this is their statement on the option for the poor and vulnerable. In a world characterized by growing prosperity for some and pervasive poverty for others, Catholic teaching proclaims that a basic moral test is how our most vulnerable members are faring. In a society marred by deepening divisions between rich and poor, our tradition recalls the story of the Last Judgment, Matthew 25, and instructs us to put the needs of the poor and the vulnerable first. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of why Catholic social teaching insists on the preferential option for the poor, and I hope you'll return again to more Do You Know series questions as we continue to explore our Catholic social teachings. Thank you very much.